In the wake of Donald Trump's re-election, Democrats are reassessing their party. Congressman Ritchie Torres from New York's 15th Congressional District in the Bronx joins the show to discuss what changes the Democrats need to make. We talk about why Democrats are slipping with demographics like young men, Latinos, and non-college voters, how to make the Democratic Party a bigger tent, why it's important to stand up to unpopular ideas from the fringe left of the party, and what regular working people actually care about. As always, thank you for listening. If you want to drop a like, subscribe, comment, all of that is greatly appreciated. And if you want to be part of building a better Democratic Party, we invite you to join us at the Center for New Liberalism. You can become a member at cnliberalism.org/become a member and join a local chapter, join our organizing Slack, get our newsletters, and much more. Thank you for helping us to build a better Democratic Party. Thank you for helping us to promote liberalism around the world. We hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining us this episode is Representative Ritchie Torres. Congressman, welcome to the show.
It's an honor to be here.
So we are in this weird spot now, having just lost the presidency in 2024. And one of the biggest questions, I think, facing Democrats at every level is, how do we build a bigger tent? If the coalition we have right now is not winning elections, then pretty much by definition, we have to welcome more people into it. But I think one of the questions that everybody's pondering over and sometimes fighting over in the wake of this loss is, what specific things do we need to do as a party in order to make that happen? And I'm curious how you think about that. Do Democrats need a bigger tent? And if so, what do we need to do to get there?
Well, the Democratic Party must be a big tent in order to remain a viable party in American politics. You know, we as a party have to make a choice. Do we wish to be ideologically pure, or do we wish to win elections? Do we wish to be ideologically pure, or do we wish to govern in a manner that enables us to win elections? And I prefer winning and governing over ideological purity. You know, winning and governing is what will enable the Democratic Party to be a successful big tent in American politics. And we have to recognize that the majority of the American people are in the center. You know, when the Republicans swung the pendulum too far to the right on the issue of abortion, the Republicans paid a price in the 2022 congressional midterms. Their red wave was reduced to nothing more than a trickle. But if we swing the pendulum too far to the left on core issues like public safety and immigration, then we will pay a price, as we did in the 2024 presidential election.
One of the themes that people seem to be discussing a lot is that Democrats, for quite a long time, have focused on issues of identity. And maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong in terms of how to approach politics. But despite having done that, Democrats are often losing ground with some of the identity groups that they seem to be, most focused on. And it's really interesting to have you in particular to talk about this, because Democrats have been slipping with specific demographics, like younger men, which you fall into, like Latinos, which you fall into, like the working class and people without college degrees. And that's especially concerning for me because I believe the statistic is something like 96% of people in Congress have college degrees. And I know you are one of the very few people who doesn't. And that's potentially a problem for our politics, just more broadly, that, people without college degrees are just not represented in our most powerful institutions. But I'm curious your perspective on how Democrats can kind of reverse the trends that have been happening where they are slipping with many of these demographics.
Look, we have to stop pandering to a far left. that is more representative of Twitch, TikTok, and Twitter than it is of the real world. And start fighting for the working class. Start returning to our roots as the party of FDR. It seems to me that Democratic politics has come to be dominated by college-educated, progressive elites who often speak for people of color without actually speaking to them. And the end result are movements like defund the police or abolish ICE or terms like Latinx. If you live on Twitter, then you could be forgiven for thinking that defund the police is a mass movement in America. But if you speak to people of color, working class people of color in places like the Bronx, then you would immediately realize that there is nothing resembling popular support for a movement like defund the police. And so we have to be far more attentive to the working class people in places like the Bronx whom we purport to represent.
I think that's such an interesting point because, like, you and I are both New Yorkers, and I've knocked on doors just through the years in almost every borough. I don't think I've been out to Staten Island to do it, but it's the place where I found probably the most pro-police sentiment is in the Bronx. That's like Eric Adams's hotbed of support. Eric Adams is not getting support from yuppies in the Upper East Side, right? He's getting support in Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx among communities of color. And I think you're right that we have to listen to the people who are actually on the ground. And I just think it's such a problem, the perception of Democrats, that I believe there was a poll recently that said among swing voters who had not made up their minds, something like 50% of them believed that defund the police was an official position for Kamala Harris. And you can't win that way, right?
Like the claim here is not that Kamala Harris ran on the far left. Quite the opposite. But the problem is that the far left has an outsized microphone and therefore has an outsized impact in defining and distorting the perception of the Democratic Party. And so the onus falls on those of us on the center left, like myself, to be far more proactive in defining who we are as a party. Rule number one in politics is if you refuse to define what you stand for, others will define it for you. And even though most Democrats are in the center left, the image of the Democratic Party is defined either by the far right in the form of Fox News or by the far left in the form of organizations like the Democratic Socialist of America. I have a quick anecdote to share about defund the police. I remember reading in the New York Times about a former colleague of mine coming out in favor of defunding the police in 2020 during the height of the George Floyd protest. And so I called him and I said, let me get this straight. You want to conduct a social experiment known as defund the police on my constituents of color in the South Bronx. And my simple question to you is, what if that experiment goes badly? What if it leads to an outbreak of gun violence and gang violence and youth violence? Like, you live in a wealthy white neighborhood in Brooklyn. You have the luxury of advocating for defunding the police. Whereas my constituents of color in the South Bronx will have to live with the consequences of your social engineering. Like, in what world should that be considered progressive? And so my basic point is most people are in a rational center, and we have to meet people where they are. We cannot impose a far left or a far right ideology on most Americans. We have to meet them where they are on core issues like public safety, like immigration, like education.
I think it's a really interesting and good point about Kamala Harris that, she was not out there running on DEI, right, or defunding the police or, open borders or anything like that. But I think she was stuck with the perceptions that this kind of progressive blob of activists and nonprofit workers and journalists and academics, and that's kind of where the public perception of Democrats comes from in a lot of ways. is just random things that extreme people will say on social media. And I also think that leads to potentially like people are sometimes scared to.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Yeah, people are I'm curious how you think about this, because people are sometimes scared to contradict that. They're worried that progressives will get mad at them. Like, just as an example, Kamala Harris did not take a stance on Prop 36, either for or against. And this is a California ballot initiative that was kind of a tough on crime thing. But even in blue California, the tough on crime initiative won 70-30. Like, that seems like something we should be able to take a stand on, but we're mad of progressives yelling at us on Twitter, basically.
I feel like the greatest threat to liberal democracy, the greatest threat to the success of the Democratic Party does not come from the far left or from the far right, but it comes from the cowardice of a center that lives in fear of the extremes. Franklin Roosevelt was exactly right when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And there are many in the center left who live in fear of the far left. The most pervasive form of censorship is self-censorship in the center of American politics. During the French Revolution, the weapon of choice was the guillotine. And it seems like during our present leftist revolution, the weapon of choice is social media. And I have colleagues who live in fear of being guillotined at the hands of a Twitter mob. And that fear factor is part of the problem. I feel like what makes me controversial is not that I'm expressing views that are far removed from the mainstream. What makes me controversial is that I'm saying what many people are thinking, but are often too afraid to say.
Is this something that you've personally experienced where, people have warned you against saying a specific thing or speaking out on a particular issue? Or, I'm also curious, have you seen, I know you're out there knocking on doors, talking to your constituents. Have you seen their views of Democrats just not align with reality because it's, they assume that you believe in defund the police because of something they heard on social media? I'm curious, like, in your personal experience, has this impacted how you run for office?
What strikes me is the disconnect between the discourse among the elites of our society and the discourse among everyday people on the ground. There's a disconnect between what matters to college-educated elites and what matters to everyday people in a place like the Bronx. Take as an example the reaction against the Washington Post decision not to weigh in on the presidential race. There was widespread outrage, and it was the subject of news coverage for multiple days. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no one in my district who cares about this. Like, so much time and energy is spent on something that is only of concern to the elites. Like, I feel like so much of our media is just a left-wing echo chamber speaking to itself without regard to what matters to everyday people on the ground.
No, I'm curious whether you're optimistic about whether we can fix this, because it sounds like we agree in kind of broad strokes on what the problem is and what needs to change, that the Democrats need to be more accepting of people who have slightly different views. We need to be a bigger tent. We need to care more about what everyday people think. I can't decide whether the problem is so endemic that we're going to be stuck with it, or whether we can turn the corner. The one thing that makes me optimistic, for instance, is I really admire Sarah McBride, the new transgender member of Congress, because she's been taking a lot of attacks, a lot of really nasty personal attacks from the Republicans, and we don't have to get into exactly what it is. But her response is basically, I'm not here to play identity politics. I'm not here to mud fight. I want to lower grocery bills for the people in my district in Delaware. And I think that's such an amazing response. I think that's exactly what we need, and how we actually reconnect with normal people, that we just refuse to get drawn into that. So I guess as a broader question, do you think that we can turn the corner, or are we kind of stuck with this mode of, elite politics that regular people don't care about?
I'm conflicted. The ideological trajectory of the party remains to be seen. It's a question mark. On one hand, I do feel like we as a party have the ability to adjust ourselves in response to the signals that voters have sent us through elections, that we have the capacity to evolve, to adapt to a new political environment. At the same time, there is a progressive, nonprofit industrial complex that has a powerful stake in the status quo. There's a whole universe of activists and academics who are deeply invested in the status quo, whose sense of identity is organized around the status quo, who profit from the status quo. Their careers depend on it. And those people are not going to see power without a fight. And so that's I think I'm somewhere in between optimism and pessimism.
How do you think about the idea that deliverism has kind of failed as a theory of politics? And for listeners who may be curious about that word, this is essentially the idea that, if you deliver big things for your voting blocks, if you deliver a big environmental bill, the environmental groups will support you. If you are a big pro-union president and do a lot of pro-union things, the unions will support you. That's kind of how a lot of politicians view things. But under the results of the last election, and given what Joe Biden has done, passed big bills, been very pro-worker in a lot of ways, a lot of people are now very pessimistic that kind of just, if we deliver big bills, automatically voters will reward us for that. Do you think there's still something to that? Or how do you see kind of the risk and reward involved in some of this stuff?
Well, first, we have to deliver what people want. So we should be delivering not only for interest groups, but for the majority of the American people on issues that matter to them the most. The American people expect the government to deliver on the basics: an affordable cost of living, safe neighborhoods and safe streets, a secure border. And if the American people conclude that you are failing at the basic functions of governing, then most people will not care about the grand ideological vision that you are preaching. Most people will not care whether you have a great society or a New Deal. People care first and foremost about the basics. You have to excel at the basics, and then you can build support for a broader ideological vision for the country. And when it came to the subject of immigration, President Biden was perceived as fundamentally failing at the basic functions of governing. There's been an overwhelming wave of migration since 2022, a wave of migration whose impact was felt not only at the border, but in states like New York, where the shelter system and the safety net and municipal finances were completely overwhelmed. In December of 2023, Quinnipiac found that 85% of New Yorkers were concerned about the destabilizing impact of the migrant crisis on New York City. Despite clear signs of popular discontent, President Biden waited 2.5 years before issuing an executive order restricting migration at the border. And by then it was too late. The Republicans had won the issue. The public had lost confidence in the Biden administration's handling of the migrant crisis. And what I found notable is when the president issued an executive order, not only was it effective at reducing migration, but it was broadly popular among every racial category: Latinos and African Americans, whites and Asians. And so if it was effective and broadly popular, then why did the administration wait 2.5 years before issuing the executive order? And the answer is simple. It was the fear of the far left, which has outsized power over the messaging and policymaking of the Democratic Party. And therein lies the fundamental problem, is that the ideological purity test of the far left are incompatible with effective governance.
I think effective governance is such an important part of this. And another thing that it really doesn't help Democrats to be, running in national elections when some of the most visible signs of Democratic governance are our biggest cities, with the urban-rural divide in the way that it is. basically every big city in America is governed by Democrats, and many of them are governed quite poorly. San Francisco is often the poster child for this, but Lord knows, as a New Yorker, that there's a lot of things that the New York Democratic Party could stand to improve quite a lot. And I know you have a perspective on this, having, served in the city council yourself, that like it's very hard to make a case for the national party when Democratic cities are just often not well run.
It's painful. I feel like I look at every major city in America and I see nothing but misgovernance. And I feel like we as a party have to prioritize competence above ideological purity. What matters is not whether you pass the ideological purity test of the far left. What matters is whether you are making government work for working people. Like, for me, the central value of progressivism should be actual progress, which is empirically measurable in the real world. But the nature of the far left is to make progressive purity the enemy of progress in the real world.
Yeah, I sometimes go back to the 2008 election, because I go back and I look, like, in practice, what does it look like for Democrats to win like a big crushing majority, to really, really win big? And so I look at 2008, and that's probably the clearest example we have in recent memory. And, Barack Obama was appealing to all sorts of people. He appealed to working class people and to elites. He appealed to rural people and urban people. He got a number of outright racists voting for Obama because he spoke to them in a way they cared about. And, I'm not saying that racism should be part of the party platform, but it's just a striking thing to say that, like, we used to be the party where even people with striking views like that would still vote for Democrats, to a party where now we tend to, I don't know, purge people who express one or two views that we don't like. And that's just doesn't seem like a reliable way to win.
Look, I feel like if we were to swing the pendulum back to the center on issues like public safety and immigration, and if we were to govern effectively, then the majority of the American people would vote for Democrats. Like, we are the natural home for most people. That's the advantage we have. And we have to get our act together, because we no longer live in a world where we can take for granted communities of color. Historically, race has been a powerful predictor of voting behavior in American society. Race is becoming less and less predictive, right? The two dominant trends in American politics are the gender gap and the diploma divide, right? College-educated women overwhelmingly favor the Democratic Party. Non-college educated men overwhelmingly favor the Republican Party. And, for a long time, if you were Latino and African-American and conservative, you would still vote Democrat for the Democratic Party, because out of historical loyalty. That loyalty has come crashing down. Now, if you're a Black conservative or a Latino conservative, you're probably going to vote Republican, or you're more open to voting Republican. And so we have to rely less on identity politics and rely more on delivering for working class people, on effective governance.
We're coming up on time, and I want to get you out of here as quick as we can, but I'll ask one more question. And this one is kind of about politics of substance versus communications, because there are kind of some schools of thought that obviously we need to change the stances of the Democratic Party. We need to change what we're standing for, and, we need to stop emphasizing this and start emphasizing that. And there are other people who believe that this is really about a communication strategy, that this is a failure of not having our own media ecosystem in the way that the right has this massive conservative media ecosystem. And it's a failure of not going into the podcast space and not going on Joe Rogan, not going on Barstool Sports and the Nelk Boys and all this kind of podcast environment that is really influential now. Do you view the problem as mostly a problem of actual policy, mostly a problem of communication strategy, or some of both equally? How do you think about it?
I feel the pundits are overthinking and overanalyzing. Occam's razor holds the simplest explanation is almost always the best. And the simple explanation is that we lost the election because of inflation and immigration. If you remove those two variables from the equation, Kamala Harris wins the election. And everything else is of secondary and tertiary importance. And, when thinking about the results of the election, I've said that we must expunge from our vocabulary the words, "we have a messaging problem." When more than 70% of Americans disapprove of the Biden administration, when more than 70% of Americans think that the country is on the wrong track or headed in the wrong direction, that is not a messaging problem. That is a reality problem. Inflation and the migrant crisis were not messaging problems. Those were reality problems. There is no amount of clever messaging that will make people feel good about paying more for groceries and gasoline. And so we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that clever messaging can make up for ineffective governance, right? That's the most important lesson that we can draw from the election. Now, on the subject of communications, I do believe that we have to be willing to go outside our ideological comfort zone of the New York Times and MSNBC. Like, the reality is we live in a brave new world of alternative media, of social media influencers and podcasters. And if we have confidence in our message as a party, then we should be willing to take that message to every corner of the alternative media ecosystem. That is part of what it means to build a Big Tent, is to reach out.
Well, we certainly hope that this is going to be successful. I am planning to be out there trying to do some of the work. I know that you are, theorizing about what we need to do and putting in the work. And hopefully we can make it happen. We've got 2 years until the midterms. We've got 4 years until the next presidential election. And Donald Trump is going to be destructive in that time, but it gives us an opportunity to refocus. And I hope we take it. I want to thank you one more time for being here. Representative Torres, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Always a pleasure.